Good evening, and thanks for joining me tonight on a night where many of you might be out trying to grab some time before the new lockdown begins, or you might well be hiding from the American election. So I'm here to distract you with some muddy thoughts while we're all feeling like we're stuck in the mud. And I'm going to be talking about mud in literature this evening. So, what got me going down this muddy route was I went on an extremely intense cycle ride over the weekend with my children when we went across the South Downs Way through amazingly massive muddy puddles, which were so muddy that we actually fell into the mud on many occasions, skidded, and became completely soaked, covered in the brown substance, which is why I'm still sporting some of it now. And I have to admit, I rather love that muddy feeling, which is why I've also gone on quite a few mud runs in my life. Any excuse to get muddy. So I wonder how you feel about mud. Are you fans of mud or do you hate it? I'm going to be exploring mud in literature this evening. And hello, Colleen, lovely to see you. Hi, Instagram users, great to have you here. Thanks for joining me tonight. I'm going to be talking about many different muddy books, and I'm sure that lots of you will have ideas about muddy books that you'd like to share with me, which I will have missed out because the more I explore the subject, the more I find that there are many muddy books in literature. So I'd actually like to start because of my own muddy experience at this weekend, which was in Sussex. I want to start with a book which is non-fiction and is based on a farm in Sussex called Knepp Farm, where the author has been trying to rewild her farm. And she describes the mud of Sussex like no one else that I've ever heard before. So I'm going to read you this passage so that you can get into the muddy mindset. And I wonder if the mud that you experience is as muddy as our mud in Sussex. Above all, it was the Sussex clay that persistently threw a spanner in the works. The soil of the low weald, 320 metres of heavy clay over a bedrock of limestone, is infamous. The people who live here know it is as bone-jarring cement in summer and unfathomable, sticky porridge at all other times of the year. Like the Inuit, who are supposed to have an entire vocabulary for snow, the old Sussex dialect has over 30 words for mud. There's clodgy for a muddy field path after heavy rain, gorm, sticky, foul-smelling mud, gubber, black mud of rotting organic mutter, ike, a muddy mess, pug, sticky yellow Wealden clay, slab, the thickest type of mud, sleech, mud or river sediment used for manure, slob or slub, thick mud, slough, a muddy hole, diluted mud saturated with so much water that it cannot drain, smeary, wet and sticky surface mud. That's definitely what I was cycling over on Saturday, and it was making me skid massively across the South Downs. Stooch, to trample ground to mud like cattle. Stodge, thick, puddingy mud. Stug, watery mud. And swank, a bog. Until the advent of sealed roads, most traffic avoided all this mud by travelling by boat along rivers and canals down to the coast and around to London by sea. There were barely any east-west thoroughfares in the county until the late 18th century, and droving roads to markets in the capital were only viable in the height of summer. Folk tales immortalised the horrors of a Sussex lane, like the traveller who, picking his way along a bank beside one, spotted a hat sitting on the muddy surface. On stretching out to pick it up, he found beneath it the head of a local man, sunk to the eyebrows. The man yanked out, thanked the traveller, and asked for help to haul out the horse he'd been riding. "But he must be dead under all that mud," the traveller said. "I could hear him munching away at something. Must be the hay wain that sank along here last week." This is a great book, which I thoroughly recommend to all of you. And I have actually spoken about it before in a previous session, which was all about literature that gets you outdoors. But as I was saying, it's one of the best descriptions of mud that I've ever heard, particularly because it relates to our very own county where I live in Sussex. But I'm sure that many of you who are joining me from around the world have similar experiences of mud. And I'd love you to tell me if you have any strange or lovely experiences relating to mud. I am a fan of mud, but I know that not everyone is. Another book which is an absolute paean to the joys of mud is another non-fiction called Mudlarking by Lara Makelem, which was a surprise Sunday Times bestseller last year. It's a really fascinating book, which is all about the pastime of mudlarking along the River Thames, which is where Lara Makelem herself lives. I'll just give you this definition of mudlarking, which is from the book. A mudlark is a person who scavenges for usable debris in the mud of a river or harbour. Also, a street urchin, a messy person, especially a child, a magpie lark. It also means playing in the mud. So Lara Makelem is actually not someone that plays in the mud. She's quite genuinely obsessed with mud and what she can find in the mud. But she does make it clear that she is in the business of looking for objects in the mud for the joy of what she might find rather than for any financial gain. Whereas there are some mudlarkers who are very much going mudlarking in order to find things that they might sell, such as diamonds, bits of gold, and other artifacts. And she tells you some really fascinating stories in this book. I'm just going to read you a couple of extracts so that you can get the feel of what the book is like. It's one that you might imagine wouldn't keep up the interest for the whole length of a book. But the way that she writes is really compelling, and she's great at bringing in the history of the objects that she finds, but also she's very much about the mindfulness of the experience of going mudlarking. And Sam, you're saying that you'd love to go mudlarking. That's great. Though I think there might be some great places to go mudlarking around these parts as well. But obviously the Thames is a great place to go, partly because it's tidal, which makes it all the more fascinating and maybe just a little bit dangerous at times. I wonder if any of you have ever done it. Tide tables commit the river's movements to paper, predict its future, and record its past. I use these complex lines of numbers, dates, times, and water heights to fill my diary, temptations to weave my life around. But it is the river that decides when I can search it, and tides have no respect for sleep or commitments. One of the things I love about this book and this author is that she's so obsessed with mudlarking that she clearly almost completely runs her life around the tides of the Thames. And I get the feeling that she might work around it as well, even if it means she has to get up in the middle of the night. I have carefully arranged meetings and appointments according to the tides and conspired to meet friends near the river so that I can steal down to the foreshore before the water comes in and after it's flowed out. I've kept people waiting, bringing a trail of mud and apologies in my wake. Missed the start of many films and even left home early to catch the last few inches of foreshore. I have lied, cajoled and manipulated to get time by the river. It comes knocking at all hours and I obey. forcing myself out of a warm bed, pulling on layers of clothes and padding quietly down the stairs, trying not to wake the sleeping house. You're gonna get the feeling of quite how obsessed this author is. She really does get up in the middle of the night to go mudlarking. And I feel that is a rather wonderful thing. I would like to join her one day. Modern mudlarks fall into two distinct categories: hunters and gatherers. I am one of the latter. I find objects using just my eyes to spot what is lying on the surface. Eyes-only foragers like me generally enjoy the searching as much as the finding and derive pleasure from the simplest of objects: an unusually shaped stone, a colourful shard of pottery, or a random blob of lead. There is an element of meditation to what we do, and as far as I'm concerned, the time I spend looking is as important, if not more so, than the objects I take home with me. Hunters, by contrast, are more demanding of the river. They are usually driven by the find, its monetary value, or its rarity. Most hunters use metal detectors, sieves and trowels to cut into the mud, breaking open the foreshore and peeling back its skin, too impatient to let time and nature take its course. In my experience, the hunters are often men, while gatherers tend to be women. Apologies, men, that seems rather sexist. And I wonder if it's true of all mudlarkers. Some of you may strongly disagree. It is rare to see a woman on the foreshore with a metal detector. There has been a mudlarking permit system in place for years for those who wish to metal detect, scrape and dig, but until recently there was some confusion over whether a permit was necessary for eyes-only searching. She then continues about the safety of mudlarking and whether it's actually quite dangerous, which I imagine it might be sometimes on the River Thames. But she also tells a fantastic story, which I will just share with you before I move on to fiction, because this story actually sounds like fiction. There's a story in her book about a famous typeface, which is called Dove's Type, which was famously lost in the river, and I'll tell you why. It was in 1916, and there were two men that created this typeface. They were called Cobden Sanderson and his partner Emery Walker, and together they founded the Dove's Press in 1900. Emery Walker was a businessman and he had lots of other things going on in his life, but Cobden Sanderson was an artist, a creative perfectionist, and he was obsessed with authenticity and craft. He created this amazingly beautiful typeface, and he based it on a 15th century Venetian type. They had to create punches, steel punches, in order to make each letter in the type. And then they made a matrix, which was created by pressing a piece of copper into the metal punch. It's all quite a complicated process, as you can tell. The type was created in 1899 and was very successful. And the two men created many beautiful and gorgeous books, which have been called indescribably beautiful. They were bound by hand and designed with a perfect balance of craftsmanship and modern utility. Cobden Sanderson, however, was a bit of a snob, and he was very much keen that this typeface would only be used for the finest literature, the most beautiful words. So he allowed Paradise Lost, for instance, to be written with this typeface and the English Bible, but he said no to lots of other possible things that could be printed. Anyway, the two men fatally fell out. So Cobden Sanderson got really upset when Emery wanted to sell the typeface and make it available to many people so that it could be mechanized and turned into something universally available. Cobden Sanderson was so upset that people were going to use his typeface for something so commercial that he started going out in the middle of the night with sacks of the typeface, and he would take a kilo at a time. It wouldn't have been a kilo then, a pound or so. And he would row out into the middle of the Thames and chuck the typeface into the Thames. So desperate was he not to let anyone use his beautiful typeface. This then became an obsession of the mudlarkers of the 21st century, that they should find the typeface itself in the bottom of the river. So in 2014, divers were sent down into the river to collect these little tiny pieces of type. And lo, verily, they found apparently 200 pieces, which I think was about 2/3 of the typeface. And our author, who wrote Mudlarking, herself found 3 letters and 1 comma, which she was absolutely thrilled to do. So that is a fantastic story. Thanks, JP, for agreeing with that. And David, hello, you said that you're on the Thames Mudlarking page on Facebook. And as a kid, you lived in Putney when the mud was full of slime, dead eels, old boots and tyres, and barges full of London's waste. That's a great story, David. Thanks for joining us and telling us that. I wonder if you found anything amazing when you were mudlarking in Putney. Tell us if you did. So yeah, mudlarking, everyone. I thoroughly recommend that as an excellent non-fiction read. Moving on to fiction, mud does make many an appearance. And as I was mentioning to JP Flintoff earlier in a little conversation, Hardy has a huge amount of mud in his Tales from Wessex, particularly in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. But I'm actually not going to go down the Hardy muddy trail tonight, because I have talked about Hardy quite a lot in other sessions that I've done on these Wednesday evenings. So I will come back to Hardy at some point, and he really does describe the dirt and the mud and the horror and the clagginess in highly descriptive, beautiful, and representational of the soul ways. But I can't have a muddy evening without mentioning Bleak House by Charles Dickens, which does begin with a fantastically muddy scene, which I'm just going to share with you. This is the first chapter. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs undistinguishable in mire. Horses, scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits of the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all around them, as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Fog very often goes with mud, and I love that description at the beginning of Bleak House, which perfectly captures the incredible muddiness of London in, I think it would have been 1852. That's when Dickens wrote Bleak House, originally in 20 episodes. And that beginning is just so full of lovely mud and lovely fog that you feel the oppression of what's to come in the book, which is a book full of passion, love, and many fascinating ideas about legal issues and motherhood. It's another book that I would hugely recommend to you to read. Might be a great one for you to read during this lockdown period. Think about that. So I'm getting quite a few comments from people who live in Sussex who are relating to that claggy, muddy description, which was in the Wilding book. It's clearly touched a nerve with many of us who walk through the mud and get stuck on the hills and quite often end up sliding down the hills on our bottoms. But I'm now going to move away to far from Sussex, to the Great American Depression. Not that we really want to think about America tonight, but I'm rewinding to 1939, which is when John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath. And this is a book which I'm sure many of you have read or studied at school, or at least know about, even if you haven't read it. It chronicles the migration of the Joad family from Oklahoma to California after industrial farming pushes them off their land, which is actually something that Steinbeck has in common with Thomas Hardy, because Hardy writes a lot about people being pushed by the new coming industrial revolution off their land and having to do other things instead. But The Grapes of Wrath is a somewhat epically depressing book. I wouldn't necessarily say that you should read it now at this point, but it is beautifully written and it does contain deeply wonderful descriptions of mud. And I'm now going to read you a section which comes very near the end of the book, chapter 39, where the Joad family are pretty much reaching rock bottom and their fate is sealed even more painfully by the mud which encroaches on their lives. Over the high coast, mountains and over the valleys, the grey clouds marched in from the ocean. The wind blew fiercely and silently, high in the air, and it swished in the brush, and it roared in the forests. The clouds came in brokenly, in puffs, in folds, in grey crags, and they piled in together and settled low over the west. And then the wind stopped and left the clouds deep and solid. The rain began with gusty showers, pauses and downpours, and then gradually it settled into a single tempo, Small drops and a steady beat, rain that was grey to see through, rain that cut midday light to evening. And at first the dry earth sucked the moisture down and blackened. For 2 days the earth drank the rain, until the earth was full. Then puddles formed, and in the low places little lakes formed in the fields. The muddy lakes rose higher, and the steady rain whipped the shining water. At last the mountains were full, and the hillsides spilled into the streams, built them to freshets and sent them roaring down the canyons into the valleys. The rain beat on steadily, and the streams and the little rivers edged up to the banksides and worked at willows and tree roots, bent the willows deep in the current, cut out the roots of cottonwoods and brought down the trees. The muddy water whirled along the banksides and crept up the banks until at last it spilled over into the fields, into the orchards, into the cotton patches where the black stems stood. Level fields became lakes, broad and grey, and the rain whipped up the surfaces. Then the water poured over the highways and cars moved slowly, cutting the water ahead and leaving a boiling, muddy wake behind. The earth whispered under the beat of the rain and the streams thundered under the churning freshets. When the first rain started, the migrant people huddled in their tents, saying, "It'll soon be over," and asking, "How long's it likely to go on?" And when the puddles formed, the men went out in the rain with shovels and built little dikes around the tents. The beating rain worked at the canvas until it penetrated and sent streams down. And then the little dikes washed out and the water came inside, and the streams wet the beds and the blankets. The people sat in wet clothes. They set up boxes and put planks on the boxes. Then day and night they sat on the planks. Beside the tents, the old cars stood, and water fouled the ignition wires, and water fouled the carburetors. The little grey tents stood in lakes. And at last, people had to move. Then the cars wouldn't start because the wires were shorted. And if the engines would run, deep mud engulfed the wheels. And the people waded away, carrying their wet blankets in their arms. They splashed along, carrying the children, carrying the very old in their arms. And if a barn stood on high ground, it was filled with people, shivering and hopeless. That's The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. An amazing and great book. Could be one to read in lockdown, but I do find it pretty universally depressing, though it does have glimmers of hope at the end, and there's a lot of mud in there in a great way. Another great lover of mud is Henry Thoreau, who wrote his epic Walden, which is, many would say, a kind of meditation on nature and on the joys of nature and the way that nature is connected to all living things. Thoreau is actually very much inspired by mud itself. He watches mud thawing in the spring, and this initiates his reflections on the interconnectedness of everything in life, from the muckiest mud to the most sublime ideas. Because as it thaws, the mud makes a distinctive web pattern that reminds Thoreau of leaves, which then make him think about recurring patterns in nature. This, for him, is nothing less than living poetry. And it's pretty amazing that Thoreau is able to find something so beautiful and interconnected and inspiring out of mud. But I think mud can be something that does unite us all, because we all know about mud. We all have mud surrounding us. We build creations out of mud when we're children. We built houses out of mud when we were first agriculturalists, or when we were first beginning to make our own dwellings, we create green shoots out of mud. We have gardens that are born out of mud. So we all have to love mud one way or the other. Some people love to get their hands dirty in the mud. Other people don't. But I'm now going to talk a bit about a lovely muddy book, which many people have been reading recently. It was published in 2018, and it has been a huge international success, selling 1.5 million copies, and it's also been picked up to be made into a film by Reese Witherspoon. It's Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, and it's a really interesting book because it has touched many a nerve, and I've met whole families that have loved reading this book. It could seem like a girl's book because the central character is a girl of 14, but I've also met many a man who's loved this book too. Let's not be sexist about our reading. So this book is about a young girl called Kaya who grows up in a swamp in North Carolina. She has actually been abandoned by her parents. Now, Ruth has just commented that she's just started reading this. Hi, Ruth, and thanks a lot for joining me tonight. So I'm going to try not to give spoilers. So I will try not to go into too much detail about this book, but it is a really inspiring and exciting book, which actually is many things, including being a thriller. So it's a book that actually starts off with a dead body, which is always a great start to get you thinking. And there's a man that's been found in the mud, and he has just been discovered by the police. And we go back and forth in time about 25 years to when Kaya is a little girl, aged about 5, and we slowly come back to the present day when the dead body is found. We also go forward to when the trial for the murder of this man is happening in court. So it's a book that has many layers, and one of the things that makes it so compelling and memorable and also appealing is the fact that Kaya, the heroine of the book, is a kind of innocent ingenue who grows up in this swamp all by herself with very little knowledge of the outside world, because her mother ran away when she was about 6 and her father leaves her behind when she's 10. She then has to struggle for survival in the swamp, living in a shack where her parents left her. She does have some help, which actually makes it believable, because there's a shop that she goes to where she sells mussels and fish that she manages to catch, and she therefore gets some money for with which she can do her cooking, get fuel for her boat, and generally look after herself. But she also is illiterate because she has never gone to school. She does find a way of learning to read, which I won't reveal because it involves another person, and I don't want to spoil this for people that haven't read it yet. And it is a really mesmerizing and intriguing and compelling story, and we are very much rooting for Kaya all the way through the novel. One of the things that comes out of the novel is many metaphors relating to mud. And there's a moment when Kaya realizes that she no longer dreamed of winging with eagles, meaning she no longer thinks that she can fly with the eagles up in the air because she's had to grow up. And the comment from the inner voice of Kaya is perhaps when you have to pour your supper from mud, imagination flattens to that of adulthood. But actually, Kaya does have a great imagination, and she manages to keep her imagination alive, and she manages to keep her poetic heart alive as well. And there's one moment which is a memory of her mother, which in a way sets the whole tone of the book, which I will read to you because it won't give anything away. It's when their mother is still living with the family, and she's with Kaya's sisters and brothers, because she actually did have lots of sisters and brothers, but they gradually disappear one by one as the book continues. And they've all just gone out on a very rare trip on the boat, because they almost never do anything that's fun, due to the fact that their father is an abusive and terrifying alcoholic. And the mother is rather stuck and unable to escape. However, they've gone out on the boat and they've all painted their toenails, wiggling their toes, their pink nails gleaming through the mud. Their ma said, "You all listen now. This is a real lesson in life. Yes, we got stuck, but what would we do?" She's saying that because they have actually got stuck in the mud, but then they've managed to escape. "We made it fun. We laughed. Yes, we got stuck, but what did we do?" That's what sisters and girlfriends are all about. Sticking together even in the mud, especially in the mud. And that is really the message of this book. That's what sisters and girlfriends are all about. Sticking together even in the mud, especially the mud. So the mud really in that book is a giant metaphor, but it's also very beautifully described because there's so much of the natural descriptions in the book, describing the birds. Kaya spends lots of her time noting down what are the natural rhythms around her, and she turns her notes into books. She draws them and notes them down. It's very inspiring. And so it's not just a metaphor, it's also very descriptive, and it is beautifully described and evoked. Another book with a giant muddy metaphor is This Book Will Save Your Life by A.M. Holmes, which is a story in which the hero is a very rich man who lives in LA, and he seems to be very contented and full of the satisfactions of being a successful man in LA. But one day he has a heart attack and is sent to the American A&E, and he has quite a terrible time recovering from his heart attack. And when he gets home, there's suddenly a giant sinkhole which has opened up in front of his house, and his house starts to fall into the sinkhole. And this is clearly a giant metaphor for his life, which has a huge hole at the heart of it. And the thing is that A.M. Holmes is a very funny writer, and I can totally recommend her as someone to read right now, because she will make you laugh at all the absurdities of life. There are many ridiculous things that happen. A horse gets stuck in the giant sinkhole. The hero has to go and rescue the horse, and the girl who owns the horse, a film star, comes to help them. They end up having to get a helicopter to get the horse out. But all of this, with the muddy landslide that's going on around his house, starts the hero on a series of acts of kindness. Random acts of kindness is what the book is all about. And it's actually a really lovely, beautiful concept in which the hero does his best to help people around him. So he helps the guy at the corner shop who sells donuts. He helps a taxi driver. He helps random people that he meets on the street. But it's actually not always that brilliant that he is helping them. So his acts of kindness sometimes generate complication. Another very muddy book, which I would like to share with you, if I can see it, is The Shepherd's Hut by Tim Winton, which is a novel about a young boy whose name is Jaxie. He's 14 and he is an absolutely foul-mouthed and quite shocking central character who narrates the whole book to us. And it is a book not for the faint-hearted, because it feels at times like every third word is fuck. And I will read you a little section of it in a minute, but it's all set in right next to the muddy salt lakes, which are just outside Perth. And Jaxie runs away at the very beginning of the book from his father, who dies in a really disgusting fashion, which I won't reveal because I don't want to give things away. But it's kind of almost comic, but it's also rather grim. And Jaxie goes off to make his own fortune, age 14, going off into the desert with very little knowledge of what's out there. But what makes it a joyful book is that Jaxie does have a love in his life, who is a teenage girl called Lee, who has one brown eye and one blue. And she is his guiding light and beacon that actually keeps him on the right track. So although he is a very complicated young man with quite a lot of issues at his heart, he's also rather lovable. And I'm going to read you, before reading a section from the book, I'm going to read you a bit by Tim Winton about his hero, Jaxie. So Tim Winton, if you don't know him, is a really amazing Australian writer. And one of my favourite books by him is a book called Breath, which I thoroughly recommend. And what I love about him is that he is incredibly good at capturing voices and capturing the way that people speak. So here's Tim Winton talking about Jaxie. I won't do an Australian accent because I'm not very good at it. To be perfectly frank, I didn't exactly choose to do it this way, talking about writing the book. To some extent, the voice chose itself. Jaxie's sound arrived with the imagery, with the scenes I began to see when this story turned up. I was writing something else at the time, so his advent was inconvenient. To that extent, Jaxie has always been consistent. I'll grant the little bugger that much. He showed up unannounced, uninvited, and damn near unmanageable from the get-go. I mean, who'd choose to write a novel from the point of view of a feral ratbag like Jaxie? He's a handful on a good day. And there were some days I wondered if I could stand another moment of him. I certainly wondered if a reader would come at him for more than a few pages. But readers have told me Jaxie endears himself somehow. They don't know whether to wring his neck or hug him and give him a feed, which makes me wonder if I wasn't underestimating the character and the reader as well. And that's a lesson for me, even this late in the caper. After nearly 40 years of doing this for a living, I clearly still need reminding how unlikely art and literature are. Art is confounding, isn't it? A work of art is something that lives and works against all odds. Something that shouldn't work is there in front of you, alive and afoot, somehow more than the sum of its unlovely parts. And I must say, Jaxie really is quite an unlovely character, at least at the beginning of the book. But then he also meets a guy out in the wilds of Perth, a guy called Fintan McGillis, who's an Irish ex-preacher, a Catholic preacher, and he's out in the middle of nowhere living in the Shepherd's Hut. And it's all very mysterious. What is he doing out there? Why does someone bring him food every 6 months? And how on earth does he survive? What's he done to send him out into the wilds of Perth? And that's what we slowly begin to find out as the novel progresses. And while Jaxie and Finton live in this wasteland next to a salt lake. And by the way, have a look at the salt lakes near Perth on Google, or check them out. There's actually a brilliant Guardian article about the salt lakes, which are in many different times of the day pink. For some reason, there's something about the natural phenomenon of salt lakes that makes them go pink or white. And they obviously also create mirages and hallucinations. They are mesmerizing. And there are also strange rocks at the end of the salt lakes, which Jaxie and Finton both quite often mistake for being people. It's a very kind of magical and mysterious book, even though it is also quite profane in many ways. But Tim Winton is someone who is very much all about using the landscape to reflect his people and his personalities, and the landscape is a character in the book. I'm going to read you a bit more about what he says about that. People are acting in the natural world, and as we now know at our end of history, we're certainly acting upon the natural world. Just ask the weather folks. But we forget the degree to which we are acted upon, that is to say, shaped by the natural world. I suspect that's a little more apparent in Australia than it is in the UK, though I think you can read it in a Brit's posture now and then, especially in the street around a tube station at 8 a.m. Is it just me imagining this, or is there a special hunch the English commuter has when upright and ambulatory? That under the brolly head down between the shoulders posture that suggests the low grey sky is heavier than taxation and Brexit. There are people like Jaxie in the UK, don't get me wrong, but their stories will play out on different terms because of place and language, which is a really good point, because if Jaxie had been a character in a Hardy novel, for instance, he would be surrounded by a very different kind of mud to the kind of mud that he finds in the outer peripheries of Perth, where they're completely really in the middle of the desert, and it is more sand or dirt than mud, but it does occasionally become mud. As to why I set this book in the salt lands, I don't know how to answer, except to say that I like strong places. I travelled and camped a fair bit in the northern goldfields of Western Australia. Places get under my skin, I guess. And if you look at a place long enough, even a place that appears empty or lacking in activity, eventually something happens. Someone emerges. I sit still, out there, or at the desk back home, and wait until something shows up. Eventually something bubbles up out of the salt crust, or the gibber plane, or the shore break. At least, that's how it's worked until now. But I guess nothing's forever. Tim Winton, great writer. And I would just like to share a bit from the book so that you get a sense of what the writing is like. This time of day, I like to take a step on the lake, not far, for the kindly light, you know, and to see what the lake might do. It's a salt lake, I said. It can't do nothing. This is Jaxie speaking when it's in the first person. But it moves all day, he said. It's forever changing. I turned back to him. He had this idiot look on his face. Have you not seen it crawl upon itself and fill and empty in the afternoons? Now and then, you know, I see the eastern shore in the sky, all those stunted trees standing on their heads above the desert. That's mirages, I said. Maybe so, he said, but there's life in them. And he got up and pushed past me into the light, which was gone all milky. Come on, Jaxie lad, I'll show you. I don't know why I followed him. Could have been because I was feeling so low and shitty, or maybe just to shut him up, but also because he left the rifle behind. He waited outside a sec, and it was just the two of us, equal, and I thought, fuck it, fair's fair, he's being decent. And that's how we went, two people side by side. And it wasn't far we went, past the windmill, out through the samphire, and onto the lake a little way. The old man was in no hurry, and that suited me fine. He slopped along in his gumboots, and the going was easy, except he kept bloody talking. It was like he couldn't stop himself. I went along next to him, feeling a bit sorry for myself again and wishing he'd shut up. We stopped walking soon enough, but the talk, that never dried up. Will you look at this boy? What a picture! What a provocation! I pulled up right beside him and looked out at the salt and the sky and the wafty light between. I used to think this was hell itself, this place I'd been consigned to, the heat and salt and flies, a place so empty a fellow's thoughts come back from it as echoes. Look out there now, how it goes on forever, like a dream there's no escaping. Can you imagine how it might have seemed to the likes of me? Terrible, strange, inhuman. And those mirages, by God, they haunted me. Every one a distortion, a travesty. Some days I used to think the lake, the salt, the whole countryside was calling to me, like something infernal. Finton, lad, come out and die. He must have seen the look I gave him, because he shrugged a bit. So that is a little section of Tim Winton's The Shepherd's Heart, which is a book full of mud and salt. It's more of a desert than a mud plain, but it does have quite a lot of mud going on, and it is a really mesmerising and compelling book. I'd just like to mention this young adult book called Mud, which is by Emily Thomas, which is a really lovely read and a great one to escape into right now during the second lockdown. It's a book about a girl whose mother has recently died, and her father has made a bit of a disaster financially, so he has to sell their house and they go to live on a barge in a river on Essex. And it's another book that's full of mud, but it's much more about the emotions of the family, really, than it is about the landscape around them. But it is a great read, and it does have a lot of lovely marshy aspects. When I was thinking about this topic of mud in literature, I wondered about some of the muddiest places that we know in the world where people still live. And this city in the Yemen, where the mud buildings are 1,000 years old, and it's one of the places where they first made skyscrapers out of mud, which is a pretty amazing and fantastic place. Unfortunately, they are now, those buildings are very much at risk from global warming, the elements, and war in the Yemen. And many people are trying to save those mud buildings, but they are under threat. And that made me think about, is there any Yemeni literature that we could explore? And there is a lovely Yemeni book called Hostage, which is about a boy being taken hostage and how he gets taken to a palace where he then finds himself caught up in a strange intrigue among the royal family. And it is a very gripping read set in the Yemen. So that is a great, interesting Yemeni book. But I'd love to hear any of your thoughts about any other muddy literature that I have not mentioned tonight. And I'm sure there's a lot of them. One that I wanted to talk about, but I'm running out of time, is Elmet by Fiona Mosley, which is set in Yorkshire. And that is a strange, compelling, and quite bizarrely shocking book in some ways, but also rather brilliant. It's another one a tiny bit like The Shepherd's Heart in a way, because it's about a boy who's 14 and it's told in his voice, and how he grows up in a very unusual way with his father, who occasionally has to do shocking things in order to keep them alive. And it was a Booker Prize contender last year. So there's also quite a few children's books that I haven't talked about in terms of mud. Stig of the Dump is a classic children's book in which many aspects of mud come into play. The hero has to build himself a house out of mud. And there's a lot of fantastic children's literature which involves creating your own muddy abodes. But I'd love to hear any of your thoughts about muddy stories. I also just wanted to share this with you because I was talking about bugs and beetles last week. I think I mentioned this fantastic illustrated book, which is called My First Kafka. It's illustrated by Rohan Eason, who is also the person that illustrated The Story Cure, written by me and Susan Elderkin. So I feel very affectionate and full of love for this wonderful illustrator. And this is a really lovely book which introduces you to Kafka, but in a child-friendly way. So that's a book that I really recommend. Possibly a great Christmas present for younger readers. So next week, I'm going to be on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook page and also on his Instagram live at 9 o'clock on the 11th of November. And the theme for next week is islands in literature. So I'd love to hear if you have any favourite islands in literature. Do join me then. And thanks so much for coming tonight. Good night.